For more than 50 years, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health has been a vital partner, safeguarding the well-being of millions of workers across the country. Recent cutbacks in the agency's personnel and budget, however, have sparked concern. For agriculture, those cuts are extending to the Upper Midwest Agriculture Safety and Health Center. Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a look at the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and animal feed industries. I'm your host, Sarah Muirhead. This episode of Feedstuffs in Focus is sponsored by United Animal Health, a leader in animal health and nutrition. You can learn more about United Animal Health and how they're working to advance animal science worldwide by visiting their website at unitedanh.com. Joining us today to talk about the recent cutbacks and what they will likely mean to the University of Minnesota's Upper Midwest Agriculture Safety and Health Center and its mission to improve the health and safety of agricultural producers, workers, and their families is Dr. Jeff Bender, UMASH Director. Let's start with a bit of history on UMASH. How did the center come to be and what role does it play for the agricultural community?
UMASH stands for the Upper Midwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center, and that is funded from the federal government, from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, which people often confuse with OSHA. And we're not the regulatory arm. It's basically an arm that focuses on worker safety. And specifically, there are 12 centers across the country to really represent how do we work with agricultural communities, agricultural workers, producers, and farm families to try to keep them healthy and safe. And as you know, labor is a big issue. So the last thing we want to do is lose people. So we're really in the business of trying to keep people safe that are working in agricultural safety and health. And that started back in 2011. So we've been around for about 14 some years.
So it sounds like there's 12 centers. So they're set up by geography then, because there's going to maybe be some different issues for different areas. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so as you can imagine, people maybe in New England, maybe it's focused on fishing and how do we protect people that are in the fishing industry. Or if it's in Florida, it might be growers for strawberries or for other commodities. Or if it's in California, it might be very different. Or here in the Midwest, it might be, soybean, corn production, swine, turkeys, dairy production. So we wanted to make sure, or at least NIOSH wanted to make sure, they wanted to give the money to the regions to actually then be kind of, in a sense, listening sessions of what are the community needs, and then how do you deal with practical applied issues to tackle some of these regional challenges, or especially for these rural communities.
Of course, some of the challenges also go across the nation, right? So is there sharing that takes place when those topics are relevant to producers everywhere?
Yeah, and actually that's one of the values of this 12 center network is that we can share resources and support one another. So for example, there's one center in Wisconsin that focuses on rural children and just children issues on farms and how do we keep kids safe on farms. I mean, there's a lot of value in having kids do the work on farms, but how do we do that safely? So there's an example of a center that does that. One of the big issues that we've been dealing with lately is basically ATV issues. And so you can imagine ATVs are being used across all the centers. And so being able to develop those resources, those educational resources of how do we actually work safely, with machinery is really important. As you know, here in Minnesota, we've actually lost a number of folks to ATV injuries, especially on rural highways. And so, that's an example of how we can transcend across center.
ATVs, PTO shafts, all those things. I remember growing up, of course, I had a 3-wheel ATV back then. Even more of a safety issue, I'm sure. So now UMASH focuses research, education, and prevention projects, as you mentioned. What are kind of the top projects that UMASH is involved in and that UMASH is probably most proud of?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a number of kind of research projects. So these are nice research projects, the ones that we can start and actually engage over a period of time. Some of those have deal with very practical issues, and some of them are actually more focused on research. So, for example, understanding viruses and movement of viruses in swine environments, or the poultry barn, or the dairy parlor. I mean, understanding and how do we kind of prevent some of that work. Other issues that have really emerged as important has been the mental health issues, especially in our rural communities. And so how do we actually provide better services, come alongside, understand what some of the barriers are, and then really be able to work in those rural communities. A good example, I think, of a small project that actually just blossomed. One of the things that we did early on when we formed UMASH is we asked, well, who are the trusted people in rural communities, and these are going to be your people that are going to be your spokespersons and trusted individuals that you would go to. And one of the ones that actually surprised me was, and I didn't really think about, is the role of the rural firefighter, the volunteer firefighter within rural communities. One, they are often members of the community, and then also they have the training. But one of the things that they don't have is they don't have really training in how to deal with farm injuries, that can happen, and understanding that farm, and then also how they can actually engage with producers to think about prevention. How do I deal with chemical issues, or electrical issues, or what if there is a tractor roller? How do I get the person out of there safely? Or if I have a grain bin injury, how do we do that? So one of the things that started as a small seed project was, how do we train, or how do we engage rural firefighters? Well, that actually has now spread, and then it spread down in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Now it's spread across the nation, and now into Canada that we're doing this. So, that's an example of basically a small community-based project, listening to the community, equipping the community to then be able to support, farmers and rural communities with that. So that's a good example of probably, one of the projects that we have. And we've got others that are like that really have been, kind of community-based, listening to what some of the needs are, and then being able to develop programs to actually support that.
Now, one of the guiding principles of UMASH is that of the One Health approach. Walk us through the importance of being able to address issues from that perspective of human health, animal and plant health, as well as the health of the environment. How do you pull all that together and when you approach projects?
That is one of our founding principles, and one of our kind of our mission in it, and it really involves the way that we try to tackle some of these issues. When we look at UMASH, we're collectively, really represent a number of different disciplines. And it's important, especially when you deal with complex issues, to really bring together bright minds from other places to deal with that. So, in our kind of executive group, we've got individuals from the Minnesota Department of Health, from the National Farm Medicine Center in Marshall, Wisconsin, from Migrant Clinicians Network, especially we deal with labor issues, as well as a number of schools and colleges within the university, pulling them together to really deal with it. So veterinary medicine, our agricultural folks, our extension folks, our medicine folks, the School of Public Health, pulling those all together. And I think, last week, we were just working with the National Pork Board, and this One Health concept really just kind of continues to blossom and emerge. When we think about how do we deal with some of the issues that farmers may have or are dealing with, and, thinking about the different disciplines that need to address that. So one of the areas was animal handling. How do you work around 300-pound sows and not get hurt? And so bringing in an animal health specialist who can really think about animal welfare, what's the best way to treat that animal, the worker, to make sure that worker, doesn't lose a knee in the process, and then also the industrial engineering people to think about, well, what's the best design for how do we move pigs and move pigs safely, and then also thinking about the safety of those animals. With the ultimate goal is that hopefully we're going to have healthy, good quality food product that consumer can enjoy. So that's a good example of where all those components of the animal, human, the environment interface is really important.
As I mentioned in the opening, there's some funding issues that have come up suddenly and unexpectedly in terms of cuts. Any initial thoughts on what the implications of those might be for UMASH as well as for the agricultural community in general?
I'm all fine for trying to create efficiencies and look at these things. And I think oftentimes when people think of NIOSH, they do think of OSHA. That, you guys got to be the regulators, and we're not. We don't regulate at all. We're basically trying to work alongside industry and other folks to kind of deal with issues that they may have. As a result, NIOSH has been dramatically cut. I mean, 85% of their workforce is gone. As a result of that, the people that actually kind of oversee what we do, we have to send our annual reports in saying, this is the progress we're making, this is who we're engaging, this is what we said we would do. And those people are gone. So we really don't have anybody that's holding us accountable to say, are you doing a good job? Nor are the people there that say, okay, we did this, and now next year we're going to do this, are there to sign off on the check to say, okay, go ahead, you can do the next year. So yeah, our funding actually is going to end in September, is what we anticipate. And with that, we have research projects that have been going on for a couple of years and are just starting to get in their stride that not going to be able to continue. So that's a very sad thing, because I think many of these research projects are, in my opinion, and I'm biased, are really amazing and just are doing some great work. And I think that they really will support the industry and support producers and workers in that regard. The other thing is we won't have money to do the community-based project. So a lot of times we try to come alongside local communities and say, hey, how do we support aging farmers in your community? Or how do we actually support mental health resources for, women, in agriculture? So those are examples of some of the funded projects that we've done that unfortunately we won't be able to do. We also try to provide kind of some seed funding for researchers that are trying to come up with new innovative ideas, or how do we make better filters? How do we make better masks? One of the big issues, one of the things that we were tasked to do was to look at, with all the discussion about H5N1 influenza, is how do we protect those workers who are being exposed? And the initial regulations are really cumbersome. Can you imagine wearing a big N95 in a milking parlor and it's hot and sweaty? And so is that the best way we can protect the worker? So part of the question that we were going to ask is, well, what's the best way to protect that worker so that they can do the work and not pass out, type of thing. So those are some of the things that we're going to lose in this process. So again, we anticipate that the funding cycle, from all indications, will end in September for us.
Well, a lot of times those aren't the research that you're doing is not something that a commercial interest is going to go and dive into and do that work. This is more a general overall kind of research that is needed, but it's not, like I said, something that's going to be taken for commercial development. So that probably it needs to be done. Who's going to do it?
Sarah, you really bring up a good point, because one of the things that, especially with smaller producers, they don't have a lot of money to have an HR department or to actually think about, having a safety manager. I mean, like big companies do. And so, in a sense, with our smaller producers, we're trying to provide tools for them so that they can think about some of these things. Okay, hey, this is the spring checklist. Before I start the tractor up, these are some things I need to do. Or this is a reminder, during harvest season, this is, some things. Oftentimes, these health and safety things are in the back of the, the mind. They're kind of, and we don't worry about it until it happens, unfortunately. So we want to prevent that. We want to prevent those things from happening. But for a very busy person, sometimes we don't think about that, and then we go, "Oh my gosh, I forgot. I didn't do a lockout tagout on that. Boy, oh boy, we never trained that worker on how to use that equipment, and sure enough, they got their hand trapped." And so those are things that often get forgotten. And especially for the smaller producer, they don't think about those things, nor that kind of research, those kind of outreach activities is not going to be funded oftentimes by industry.
So what, I know it's probably too early to say, but what's next for UMASH? Is there a future? You mentioned funding might be going away in September. Or is there a scaled down future? Is there any future? Do you have any sense of that at this point? Or are you still doing that evaluation?
Largely, our funding is through NIOSH. And so the real dramatic impact is going to be on our research projects. So, we fund a number of researchers who are doing work, air quality, on mental health, on rural firefighters, on protecting swine workers in barns. Those projects are going to have to end, unfortunately. And the funding that we have to support any community-based project or small grants, those are going to disappear. The outreach activities that we do, unfortunately, those individuals that really support that are going to be probably let go. And so really, ideally, I think, here in Minnesota, we know that we want to keep that rural workforce healthy and safe. And so will others be able to pick that up, or, will we look a little bit differently, or it's going to be really scaled back a lot, to be honest with you.
So then what's the future of NIOSH?
That's a good question, Sarah. From the looks of it at this point, all the training centers have been eliminated. All the labs have been eliminated. So really, NIOSH really doesn't exist anymore. I know that there's discussion about it being incorporated as a new version, but we don't really have any details. At this point, it's been virtually eliminated.
So if any of our listeners here might have a concern and they want to express that somehow, what would you say is the best way to go about that?
One is to talk with their industry folks. So, maybe they're turkey producers or poultry producers, or maybe they're the dairy producers, or, corn and soybean producers. One is to talk about, well, how is our organization going to deal with health and safety issues? How are we going to do that? How can we support this kind of work and effort? So I think that's part of it. The other part is actually engaging legislators. One of the things that we do is that we do try to meet with our legislators, and usually as listening sessions, try to kind of, well, what are your constituents telling you? What are the issues? Now, we've heard from our legislative folks many years ago that, hey, we need to do more mental health work and outreach. What are you doing in those communities? And so, as a result of that, we did engage and try to do some of that outreach and engagement. So I think, again, part of it is to engage those legislators and say, who's going to be doing kind of health and safety education, outreach, and training if we don't have this kind of, mechanism in place? How can we support that? UMASH has been great because they've been helping engage and actually, being responsive to the needs of our communities.
Our thanks to Dr. Jeff Bender, Director of the Upper Midwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center. This episode of Feedstuffs in Focus has been sponsored by United Animal Health, a leader in animal health and nutrition. You can learn more about United Animal Health and how they're working to advance animal science worldwide by visiting their website at unitedanh.com. I'm Sarah Muirhead, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. If you would like to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and animal feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast channel. Until next time, have a great day, and thank you for listening.